When you're learning something, you've got to trust in the process. There's no other way. You kinda just have to accept that you might fail, and perfection is unattainable, and you just gotta be ready to move on. Otherwise, what's the point? For a while, I thought it was just gonna be that simple, and that was exactly how I would respond given the opportunity. But it turns out I didn't really know much about anything. You see, I was a couple weeks into wrapping a car, the second car I'd ever wrapped. And before finishing that second car, I was definitely a newbie. I mean, I was so new that I planned multiple attempts for every panel.
I'd basically need almost triple the material someone who was experienced would need.
Now this is when that was all supposed to change.
Now, it's not like I was expecting to get better overnight or anything like that, but at this point, it was my second car that I'd wrapped, so I should at least be able to bring in the reins a bit. Right?
Or at least that was my plan going into this second wrap. And the progress up until now definitely supported that idea. So far, this had went a lot smoother than I was planning, and when I showed up for this final day, in my mind, it was just that, the final day. After all,
the car was mostly complete. I guess we technically still had to do the entire rear bumper, the side skirts, the rear quarter panel, and the wing, but still.
For a process as long and complicated as wrapping an entire car, only having a couple panels left is interesting. Just because, technically speaking, we have less panels to do than the ones we've already done, does not necessarily mean that we're on the home stretch. After all, we've got lots of mistakes to correct. So really, we're still in the weeds when it comes to the whole process. I did, however, have a pretty clear idea where I wanted to start. We left off after doing the trunk/hatch, so we might as well finish that off by doing the wing. And it's pretty straightforward. Since this is such a harsh angle, it's likely best to do this in one or two pieces, or at least one piece that has a cut on the bottom so that it can fold over and you can get rid of a bunch of these creases. And that's exactly what I did. I hid the crease on the bottom underneath the spot where it's going to be covered up by the aero, and the wing was pretty much good to go.
So next I moved on to the rear bumper, and before you get too excited, no, this wasn't really much that was very new. We're gonna break it into a bunch of panels, and it should go fairly smoothly, I hope.
Like I mentioned in the last episode, the rear bumper is going to be a lot easier than the front bumper, and that is mostly because of these body lines that you see right here, the vertical and horizontal ones. While you could definitely do the bumper in one piece, for this attempt I chose to hide seams in each one of these body lines. That way the risk of losing vinyl is a lot lower because we're going to waste a lot less. It's a lot easier to replace one of these single pieces than it is to replace one piece that's the size of the entire bumper. Plus, as you can see here, since there's a body line, once we cut it, you can't even see the inlay, which is super cool. The idea of inlays in general is a technique that I've gotten a lot better on in this car when compared to doing the S4. There's a ton of pieces on that car that if I could go back in time and redo, and we might in the future, I would. And I think the new techniques would really help out a lot with that. You'll also notice that the area where the plate sits is a lot of heating similar to the indent for the door handle. It's one of those situations where you just want to go really slow and work your way in from the edges as opposed to starting in the middle. If there's any air trapped in there, the whole thing's going to try to lift up, so it's really important to make sure it's all pushed out. Other than that, the rear bumper was, for the most part, pretty straightforward. I prepped each part individually, and really the only thing that I had a little bit of issue with was this piece on the bottom, mostly just because it's a little hard to tuck it into the diffuser, but it's not impossible. And with the bumper done, we were one step closer to the goal, meaning it was time to move on to something we hadn't done before, the side skirts. Thankfully, however, these are super simple. It's basically one straight line of material, and tucking it into the door is actually a lot easier than you would think. Plus, this was the rocker panel that we replaced, so it's the only part of the car that has real paint, which means we didn't have to do nearly as much prep work. The other side, however, we definitely need to sand like normal. And as far as keeping the bottom attached, the side skirts that we made with splitter gang are actually going to do a very good job of this. The front wheels are going to kick a bunch of dirt and grime up onto this vinyl, so those side skirts being there really just serve as some added protection. And with that, we were good to move on to a panel that we've done before, however mirrored. Now we're going to do the other rear quarter panel, and this is one of those panels that's just long, both in the time it takes you to do it and the amount of vinyl you actually need, because it spans the entire car. There were a couple mistakes that I made in the first one, so my goal with this second rear quarter panel was to just do better. And the cool thing is, since it was the second time I had done a rear quarter panel, I knew the best way to approach it. I was able to get it to lay down a lot better than last time. And overall, I think we ended up with quite a few less mistakes on this side, so it's a lot better. One technique I do want to talk about is tucking the vinyl into the actual weatherproofing. This is really notable for all the areas surrounding glass. That weatherproofing is tight, so you might need to use two squeegees, one to pry it away and the other to push the material in. With that knowledge, I was armed enough to complete this rear quarter panel, and if you're paying attention to the progress of the overall car, you might notice that this was the final panel for the whole thing to be covered. Technically speaking, at this point the TT was wrapped, and that's a pretty big moment considering how much time we've dedicated to this. A lot of people would find immediate joy in this, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe that's just me, but I felt like there was more I needed to do, and for the most part there was. The main thing I promised that I would redo was the front bumper, so I immediately took it off and started to redo the top part. There were quite a few techniques I messed up the first time I tried this, namely having to do with using an inlay around the grille. I tried that a couple times and it just never looked great. So I'm gonna try this time to get the entire top half of the bumper done in one piece. We can't just wrap over that little divot though, or it's gonna look weird. So what I'm doing is tucking it in with the squeegee and making sure that the material is stretched in a way so that it is relaxed in there. This took a long time, but I think the result was well worth it. I was also able to improve the edges by each of the fenders. While this is a lot better, it's not perfect. I've talked about this on the channel before, but perfection's always been weird conceptually to me. We just put weeks of work into this thing.
Weirdly enough, that doesn't mean I was happy with where the car was at. This is where it was starting to get to me. The quest for something that ultimately does not exist. Perfection. Sure, the car looks a lot better than it did, but at the time, all I saw in it were the imperfections. Stuff you would never notice unless I pointed it out, but it wasn't perfect. Nothing's perfect.
I told myself when I was going into this that I wasn't going to let what happened to me with the S4 happen again. I was obsessing over every small imperfection to the point that I never really appreciated what I had done. Especially when you're learning, you can't make something perfect. But if you're detail-oriented, it's so hard not to try.
And the more time I spend obsessing over the smallest things, the more time I lose working on other, more important projects.
Internally, I was in a spiral. I've got 2 other projects going on and a lot of videos that I need to make, but at the same time, there's a couple panels that I'm gonna need to redo at some point. Not for anything major, just for something small. A speck of dust here, a poorly cut edge there. At the end of the day, what really defines an issue? Is it worth taking hours of my time to redo an entire panel when I haven't even seen this car in the sun? Not to mention the other cars which also need work. It was a slippery slope.
This is a spiral, and I was trapped.
And this is not a new issue to me. In fact, it's something I've struggled with for most of my life, in almost everything I do. Obsessing over details can definitely be constructive. It helps you turn out quality with pretty much everything you do. But there's a limit. When the pursuit of perfection takes away from other things, you've got an issue. And sometimes you need to reset. Many times, the best choice is to just take a step back. If you're so close you can only see the small details, sometimes it's hard to see the big picture. And there's always a good chance you're putting more pressure on the situation than it really needs. After all, this deadline was self-imposed.
So that's the thing. We don't have to fix all of this right now.
I was so fixated on the issue of making things perfect that I forgot about one of my favorite parts of vinyl wraps. And it's just that. Parts. You wrap a car panel by panel, and the same thing actually goes for replacing them. So rather than letting obsession spiral into me redoing the whole thing, I want to see how far we've come. and I started the reassembly with some ceramic coating. This is another product that Vivid sent me, and it basically protects the vinyl. Like with other ceramic coatings too, it helps keep your car clean. It does, however, need to cure for a while, so we're gonna put it on, go somewhere for a while, and then come back. For this, I worked in 2 foot by 2 foot square areas, and I made sure I covered the entire car. Once the ceramic coat was on, I figured it was as good of time as any to reinstall the taillights. And along with that, I decided to reinstall all of the emblems. Though my TT badge is worse for wear, so that one's just installed temporarily with double-sided tape. To me, the car also looks completely naked without aero, so I'm reinstalling all the aero that was on the car before. And the cool thing is that all the panels I want to redo sometime in the future don't touch the aero, so we shouldn't have to take this off again. So the car's technically wrapped, and the aero's installed. But that's not really the end, because I want to redo panels at some point in the future. So the end is not the end. We really just have other big projects we need to work on, and it's probably a healthy idea to take a step back and see just how far we've taken the car. Because, after all, it's a lot different, and I would say we've definitely made an improvement in the car overall. So I figure it's about time we see the car out in the wild. With the car out in nature, you can definitely see the amount of range this color has. Just like I thought when I saw it in the garage, it is a very interesting color. It's got this almost steely gray-blue look in the shade, but in direct sunlight, it's almost akin to cotton candy. Honestly, it's a really pretty color. And don't even get me started on the finish. I am honestly incredibly shocked at just how glossy this vinyl is. This car, for the entire time I've owned it, has never had a reflection, so this is ridiculous. This vinyl has a finish that, in my opinion, is a lot closer to paint than most vinyls that I've ever seen. I'm glad I ran into it on the S4, and I am so excited that the TT looks like this. It's a lot different than the silver, but I think it's a good different. I love the color, and more than anything, I've come to terms with the application. Like I said, it's not perfect, and I am by no means an expert installing vinyl. But what was my goal again from the very beginning? All I wanted in doing this when I set out was for it to be better and for me to have made progress since when I wrapped the S4. And based on how this looks and how it's holding up, I would say we've met that goal. And I can absolutely promise that the next car we wrap is going to be even better. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. Right now, that's the best way you can support me. I've got a ton planned for the channel, and I hope you are as excited as I am. So once again, thank you. Have a wonderful day.